The Mississippi River crossing at Helena operated according to precise rhythms. By dawn, the ferry began its first run from Arkansas, carrying tobacco bales and timber south. By mid-morning, enslaved workers loaded cotton onto flatboats heading north. By afternoon, the plantation docks processed incoming supplies, sugar, tools, rope, occasionally human cargo. Sarah had memorized these rhythms over 3 years of working Thornton's tobacco plantation. She knew which hours brought crowds that concealed movement, which ferry operators checked papers carefully, which didn't check at all. The sorting barns smelled of dried tobacco leaf and sweat. Sarah worked the third station from the door, grading leaves by color and texture, separating premium grade from standard, standard from damaged. Her hands moved with mechanical efficiency. Pick, evaluate, sort, next. 20 other workers occupied the barn, mostly women, filling woven baskets that enslaved men carried to the pressing house. Conversations happened in fragments, voices low. "Patterson came through again yesterday," said Dinah, working the station beside Sarah. "Checked papers at the Johnson place upriver." Sarah kept her eyes on the tobacco. How many did he take? None. But he stayed 2 hours asking questions. Dinah paused. He's hunting something specific. The headscarf Sarah wore was tied tight, shading her face even in the barn's dim interior. Her fingers never stopped moving through the leaves. She'd learned years ago that stillness drew attention. Constant work made you invisible. The door opened. Sunlight cut across the packed dirt floor. Sarah glanced up for half a second. Habit, awareness, survival instinct, then back to the leaves. The visitor was Patterson himself. She recognized his silhouette, tall frame, broad shoulders, 2 pistols visible on his belt, leather saddlebags over one arm. He spoke with the overseer Monroe near the door. Their voices carried poorly in the barn space, but Sarah caught fragments. New bounty posted. Distinctive marking, $800. Monroe called out. "Everyone keep working. Mr. Patterson is conducting routine verification." Patterson walked down the center aisle between workstations. He moved slowly, examining faces with professional detachment. Most workers kept their heads down. A few met his gaze with the carefully calibrated deference that satisfied white authority without appearing suspicious. Sarah maintained her rhythm, pick, sort, but track his progress through peripheral vision. He stopped at her station. "You." His voice was neutral. "Look up." Sarah raised her head. The headscarf shadowed her face, but not enough. Patterson's eyes locked onto her left cheek. The brand scar was distinctive. 2 initials burned deep into skin, healed badly over years, leaving raised tissue that caught light unevenly. The letters were LH, her original owner's mark, applied when she was 16 after her first escape attempt. Patterson stared for 3 seconds. Sarah held his gaze. She'd learned that too much deference suggested guilt. Normal eye contact, then back to work. "That's quite a scar," Patterson said. "Cooking accident, sir. Hot pot of lye fell 3 years back." The lye was smooth, practiced. Thornton himself believed it. "Looks like a brand to me." "No, sir. Just unfortunate scarring from the burn." Patterson reached into his thul bag, extracted a folded paper. He opened it slowly, making Sarah wait. The bounty notice was printed on cheap paper, already worn from handling. He held it where Sarah could see. Runaway slave. Female, approximately 25 to 30 years of age, medium height, branded on left cheek with initials. Escaped from Landon Hayes Plantation, Natchez, Mississippi, September 1848. $800 reward for return. Considered dangerous. Sarah's heartbeat accelerated, but her hands continued sorting tobacco. The description could match thousands of women. The critical detail was the name of the plantation, Natchez, where she'd been enslaved before creating false documentation and buying her way onto Thornton's land as a transferred worker with forged papers. Does that description concern you? Patterson asked. No, sir. I've been at Mr. Thornton's place 5 years. Another lie. 3 years, but Patterson couldn't verify that easily. Papers can be faked. Yes, sir, I expect they can. But mine are registered with the county. Patterson folded the notice, slipped it back into his bag. He didn't leave. Instead, he looked around the barn, noting exits, memorizing the layout. His gaze returned to Sarah's face, specifically to the scar. I'll be around the area for a while, he said. Checking up on things. He walked out. The barn stayed silent for 10 seconds after the door closed. Then Dinah whispered, Lord help us all. Sarah's hands finally stopped moving. That night in the quarters, a row of crude cabins housing 40 enslaved workers, Sarah lay awake on her pallet while 2 other women slept nearby. Moonlight came through gaps in the plank walls. She could hear the river in the distance, a constant whisper of possible escape. The memory arrived unbidden, triggered by seeing the bounty notice. She was 16, working in the big house at the Hayes plantation in Natchez. Landon Hayes was a cotton grower, wealthy, cruel in casual ways rather than theatrical ones. His cruelty was administrative, buying and selling people like furniture, breaking up families because it simplified accounting, punishing minor infractions with major violence to establish precedent. Sarah, she'd been called Celia then, had been taught to read by Hayes' elderly mother, who believed enslaved house workers should be able to follow written instructions. It was a practical decision, not humanitarian. But literacy created possibilities. Celia learned to forge passes, to read newspapers left in trash, to understand the legal mechanisms that kept her enslaved. Her first escape was impulsive. She was 16, angry, convinced she could reach Memphis and disappear. She lasted 4 days. The slave catcher who found her brought her back efficiently. No particular malice, just business. Hayes ordered the branding as insurance against future attempts. Hot iron, 2 letters, held against her face for 5 seconds while 2 overseers held her down. The smell was what she remembered most. Burning skin has a specific odor, meat cooking, but wrong. The pain came second. The shame came third, knowing she now wore Hayes' mark permanently, advertising her attempt to claim freedom. She escaped again at 21, 5 years later. That attempt succeeded. She made it to Vicksburg, found an underground network, obtained forged papers identifying her as Sarah Washington, sold from the Thornton plantation in transit, purchased by Thornton again after dispute resolution. The forgery was excellent, included fake bills of sale and county registration stamps. Cost her every cent she'd saved over 8 years, plus money borrowed from the network that she was still repaying through information and assistance. The papers got her onto Thornton's plantation. She'd been there 3 years, working, invisible, careful, until Patterson noticed her scar. Morning came with the bell. Workers rose, used the outdoor privy, gathered at the water pump, lined up for cornmeal rations distributed by the plantation cook. Sarah joined the line, accepted her portion, ate standing up. The morning routine was communal but not social. Everyone conserved energy for the workday. Isaiah found her near the sorting barn. He was 50-something, exact age unknown even to him, with gray in his hair and a permanent stoop from decades of dock work. He carried a barrel on his shoulder, moving it from one storage area to another, work that gave him mobility around the plantation. Patterson sent a telegram yesterday, Isaiah said quietly, not looking at Sarah. Saw the telegraph operator's boy heading back. Patterson's checking registries downriver. How long before he confirms? Sarah asked. Week, maybe 2. Depends on how thorough he is. Sarah nodded. Isaiah set the barrel down, rolled it toward the dock. Their conversation appeared incidental, just 2 workers exchanging words while moving through space. Isaiah had been at Thornton's plantation for 30 years. He'd survived by becoming useful. He knew shipping routes, dock procedures, ferry schedules. White men asked him for information because he provided it reliably. What they didn't know was that Isaiah used the same mobility to pass information through an informal network stretching from New Orleans to St. Louis. He wasn't part of any organized underground railroad, but he knew who was, where they operated, which routes were compromised. He'd recognized Sarah as a runaway within weeks of her arrival. Never said anything, just watched. When she finally asked him directly, he simply nodded and said, "You're careful. Keep being careful." Now careful wasn't enough. Rebecca arrived at Thornton's plantation on a Wednesday morning in late September. She came on a flatboat with 3 other enslaved workers, recently purchased from an estate sale in Arkansas. She was 19, thin, with eyes that moved too quickly, taking in everything with undisguised curiosity. Sarah recognized danger immediately. Rebecca asked questions constantly. She wanted to know about the river, about the Free States, about whether anyone had ever successfully escaped from Thornton's place. She spoke loudly, carelessly, as if the overseers weren't always listening. The other workers avoided her. Dinah told Sarah privately, "That girl's going to get herself killed, and maybe take someone with her." On Rebecca's 3rd day, she approached Sarah during the midday water break. "That scar on your face, how'd you get it?" The question was loud enough that Monroe, the overseer, turned his head. Sarah's response was automatic. "Cooking accident. Liapot. Doesn't look like a burn. Looks like a brand." Rebecca said it with innocent observation, no malice. Monroe walked over. "What's this about a brand?" "Nothing, sir," Sarah said. "Just a burn scar. She's new, doesn't know." "I know brands," Rebecca persisted. "My mama was branded after." "Enough," Monroe interrupted. "Get back to work." But the damage was done. Monroe looked at Sarah's face with new attention. He'd seen the scar hundreds of times, accepted the cooking accident story because no one questioned it. Now he was questioning it. That afternoon, Patterson returned to the plantation. The conversation happened in Thornton's office. Sarah wasn't present but learned the details from Isaiah, who overheard from the main house porch. Patterson had requested a formal examination of Sarah's documentation. Thornton, nervous about potential liability, agreed immediately. If Sarah was a runaway with forged papers, Thornton could face legal consequences for harboring her, even unknowingly. The examination would happen in 3 days. Patterson would bring a clerk from the county office to verify the authenticity of the original sale documents. If the papers proved false, Sarah would be detained immediately, held pending confirmation of her identity, then returned to her legal owner, Landon Hayes in Natchez. Isaiah delivered this information to Sarah after dark, speaking quickly near the water pump. 3 days. After that, you're in chains or you're gone. Sarah asked, "What do you know about Patterson?" "What do you mean?" "His methods. His cases. His mistakes." Isaiah stuttered her. "You're not planning to run." "I'm planning something else." Patterson operated from a circuit that covered northern Mississippi, southern Missouri, and eastern Arkansas. He worked for multiple plantation owners simultaneously, tracking runaways on commission. The business was lucrative. Rewards ranged from $200 to $1,000 depending on the enslaved person's value and how long they'd been missing. Patterson was known for high success rates and for being thorough. What most people didn't know was that Patterson also supplemented his income through coercion and fraud. Isaiah explained it to Sarah over 2 careful conversations. Patterson would target free black people with questionable documentation, threaten them with slavery unless they paid him off. He'd falsify claims about runaways to collect rewards, sometimes collaborating with plantation owners to create fake escapes and split the payment. He'd intimidate witnesses, plant evidence, and occasionally assault people with no legal recourse. He was effective because the system protected him. Testimony from black people, enslaved or free, carried no legal weight against a white man. Even if Patterson committed clear crimes, prosecuting him required white witnesses willing to testify, which was rare. But he made mistakes. He kept detailed notebooks documenting his cases, including notes about illegal activities. He drank heavily at a tavern 8 miles north of the plantation, bragging about his methods. He had debts, unpaid bills, enemies among white merchants who resented his business practices. Sarah spent 2 days gathering information. She volunteered for additional work that took her to the main house, where she overheard conversations and glimpsed correspondence on Thornton's desk. She spoke with Isaiah's contacts, other enslaved workers, a few free black farmers, even a white tavern owner named Hutchins who hated Patterson for unpaid debts. The picture that emerged: Patterson was dangerous, but not invincible. He was a criminal who happened to work within a legal profession. If Sarah could expose his crimes, specifically crimes against white people, she might neutralize him before he destroyed her. The second incident happened 48 hours before Sarah's scheduled documentation review. Rebecca, desperate and inspired by fragments of conversation about freedom, attempted her own escape. She left at night, heading north toward the river crossing, planning to somehow reach Illinois. She was captured by dawn. Patterson himself found her hiding in a tobacco barn 6 miles from Thornton's plantation. He brought her back in chains. The whipping happened at noon, in front of all the workers. Thornton ordered it as an example: 40 lashes, delivered by Monroe. Rebecca was tied to a post, stripped to the waist. The whip was leather, weighted, designed to cause maximum pain. Monroe was efficient, not cruel, but the result was the same. Rebecca screamed for the first 20 lashes, then went silent, shock taking over. Sarah watched because everyone was required to watch. The lesson was clear: attempted escape resulted in agony. Don't resist. Don't hope. Don't try. After the whipping, Rebecca was cut down and carried to the quarters. Sarah helped tend her wounds, cleaning the torn skin, applying grease to prevent infection, trying to ease pain that was fundamentally untreatable. Rebecca was conscious but didn't speak. Her eyes were open but focused on nothing. In her delirium, Rebecca whispered something. Sarah leaned close. Patterson said he never fails. Even if he has to, make the runaway himself. Sarah went still. What do you mean? But Rebecca had slipped into unconsciousness. That night, Sarah made her decision. She told Isaiah, "I need to see Patterson's notebooks." That's suicide. Maybe. But if I run now, he'll hunt me forever. I need to destroy him first. You can't destroy men like Patterson. No, Sarah agreed. But I can expose him. And exposure might be enough. Isaiah was silent for a long moment. Then, he camps northeast of here, near Cypress Creek. Goes to Hutchins' tavern most nights. Keeps his saddlebags with him always, but when he's drunk, he's careless. Can you get me there? I can get you close. After that, you're on your own. Sarah nodded. I need one more thing. Clothes. Something different than what I'm wearing. And makeup, theatrical makeup, if you can find it. Isaiah looked at her face, at the scar. You're going to change your appearance. I'm going to become someone else entirely. 24 hours before the documentation review, Sarah disappeared from Thornton's plantation. Monroe discovered her missing during the morning count. He immediately notified Thornton, who sent for Patterson. The system activated quickly. A runaway slave was valuable property in flight, and recapturing her was simple business. Patterson arrived by mid-morning. He examined Sarah's cabin, questioned other workers, assessed the situation with professional efficiency. He seemed almost pleased. She ran. That confirms guilt. Innocent workers don't flee. Thornton was angry. Angry at Sarah for making him look foolish. Angry at himself for trusting forged papers. Angry at the potential financial loss. Find her. Quickly. Patterson nodded. I'll have her in chains within 3 days. And when I do, she'll wish she'd stayed. He rode out heading northeast, tracking the obvious route toward the river crossing. Behind him, Monroe spread word of the escape, offering additional payment for information. The plantation community withdrew into careful silence. No one spoke Sarah's name. But Sarah wasn't heading northeast. She was 12 miles due north, standing in Isaiah's safe house, a storage shed behind a sympathetic farmer's property, wearing clothes she'd never worn before. The transformation was systematic. Isaiah had obtained a simple dress, worn but respectable, the kind a free woman doing domestic work might own. He'd gotten theatrical makeup from a traveling show that had passed through 2 weeks prior. White powder, rouge, materials actors used to change their appearance on stage. Sarah worked carefully. She covered the brand scar with layers of paste and powder, blending it until the letters were invisible under a smooth surface. She couldn't eliminate the scar's texture, but she could hide the distinctive marking. She changed her hair, pinning it differently. She adjusted her posture, straighter, more confident, the bearing of someone who'd never been forced to make themselves small. When she finished, Isaiah stared. "I wouldn't recognize you." That's the goal. She practiced a new name, a new history, a new voice. Mary Henderson, free woman, born in Illinois, traveling for work. The identity came with forged papers, rough but functional. They wouldn't survive careful scrutiny, but they might pass a casual inspection. What happens now? Isaiah asked. Now I find Patterson, and I make him show me who he really is. Patterson's camp was exactly where Isaiah said it would be, a clearing near Cypress Creek, 15 miles northeast of Thornton's plantation. Sarah approached at dusk, moving carefully through trees, observing before committing. Patterson had 2 men with him, both assistants who worked his cases. They'd built a small fire, were cooking salt pork and cornmeal, drinking from a shared whiskey bottle. Their horses were hobbled nearby. Saddlebags lay piled near the fire, multiple sets, including Patterson's distinctive leather bags. Sarah waited. The men ate, drank more, talked in low voices about various cases. After dark, Patterson announced he was going to Hutchins Tavern for proper drinking. One assistant went with him. The other stayed to guard the camp. This was the opportunity. Sarah circled the camp, approaching from the direction opposite where Patterson had departed. The remaining guard was young, bored, more focused on the whiskey bottle than his surroundings. Sarah waited until he sat with his back to the saddlebags, then moved. She was quiet, but not silent. The guard turned, reaching for his pistol, but Sarah was already speaking. "Don't shoot. I'm lost. I need help." She used her Mary Henderson voice, frightened but not panicked. The guard hesitated. Sarah was a black woman, alone, no obvious threat. He relaxed slightly. "You shouldn't be out here alone." "I know. I was traveling to Helena, got separated from my employer's wagon. Have you seen anyone pass?" The guard lowered his pistol completely. "No one's passed here. Where are you coming from?" While he talked, Sarah's attention was on the saddlebags. Patterson's were distinctive, darker leather, brass fittings. They were 10 feet away, partially open. "Missouri," Sarah said, feeding the guard a prepared story. She let him ask questions, using the conversation to drift closer to the bags. He was young enough to be distracted by a woman's presence, even a black woman, even in these circumstances. When he turned to gesture toward the river, explaining directions, Sarah dropped into a crouch, grabbed Patterson's thul bag, and ran. The guard shouted. Sarah crashed through underbrush, the bag clutched tight. She heard him behind her, cursing, chasing, but slowed by darkness and unfamiliar terrain. Sarah knew this land. Isaiah had mapped it for her, shown her the paths, the obstacles. She led the guard in circles for 10 minutes, then vanished. He kept searching, shouting for Patterson, but Sarah was gone, and so were the saddlebags. 2 miles away, in a hollow tree she'd identified earlier, Sarah opened Patterson's notebooks by moonlight. There were 3 journals, filled with dense handwriting. She read quickly, looking for patterns, for evidence, for anything that could be used against him. What she found exceeded expectations. Patterson documented everything. Cases, rewards, methods, contacts. But he also documented his illegal activities, not out of stupidity, but because he needed to track his own lies. He noted which plantation owners he'd collaborated with on fake escapes, splitting rewards 60-40. He recorded bribes paid to clerks for false documentation. He listed free black people he'd extorted, amounts collected, threats made. Most damning, he'd written about Missouri cases where he'd falsified evidence. One entry read, "Henderson case, no proof of enslavement, but reward paid anyway. Clark Jackson took $50 to forge transit documents. Subject returned to claimant despite probable free status." Sarah memorized names, dates, amounts. Then she heard voices, Patterson and his assistant returning to camp, discovering the theft. Their shouts echoed through the woods. Sarah closed the notebooks, wrapped them in cloth, and ran. Patterson's rage was methodical. He didn't shout or curse. Instead, he organized. By midnight, he'd sent messengers to 3 nearby settlements, offering a $100 bonus on top of the original $800 reward for Sarah's capture. He'd mobilized a posse of 5 men, professional slave catchers and opportunistic hunters motivated by profit. He'd sent word to Thornton's plantation, to the county sheriff, to ferry operators along the river. The hunt expanded from one man's professional interest into a coordinated operation. Sarah wasn't just a runaway slave anymore. She was a thief who'd stolen from a white man. That transformed the pursuit from business into personal vendetta. Isaiah brought Sarah this information at dawn. They met in the ruins of an old mill house, 3 miles from any active settlement. Sarah sat with Patterson's notebook spread before her, taking notes on scraps of paper. "They're mobilizing fast," Isaiah said. "Patterson's put out word you're dangerous. Says you attacked his assistant, stole documents, and money." "Did I attack anyone?" "No. But truth doesn't matter here." Sarah looked up from the notebooks. "I know. That's why I need to use the only truth that does matter, money and reputation." She explained her plan. The Missouri border settlement was called New Market, barely a town, more a collection of buildings serving ferry traffic and river trade. It had a federal marshal's office, a courthouse, 3 merchants, Hutchins Tavern, and a boarding house. Population fluctuated between 50 and 200 depending on the season. More importantly, New Market was just across the Missouri state line. Legal jurisdiction was complicated there. The Fugitive Slave Act required Missouri authorities to cooperate with slave catchers from other states, but Missouri also had its own laws, its own courts, its own officials who sometimes resented outside interference. Sarah's plan required her to become Mary Henderson completely. The disguise wasn't just physical anymore. It was legal, psychological, tactical. She needed to believe she was free, to embody freedom so thoroughly that even doubt seemed impossible. Isaiah provided the final elements: better forged papers, a letter of introduction supposedly from an Illinois employer, a small amount of money. He also provided something more valuable: contacts. Names of people in New Market who might help, or at least not actively hinder. "Marshal Dawes runs the federal office," Isaiah explained. "He's fair by the letter of the law, which means he'll follow the Fugitive Slave Act without hesitation. But he also doesn't like corruption, and he especially doesn't like slave catchers who operate outside legal bounds. So if I can prove Patterson's corrupt, Dawes might care more about that than about you." Sarah nodded. "What about witnesses?" "Hutchins, the tavern owner, hates Patterson. Owes him money, but also Patterson's threatened him. If you need a white man to testify about Patterson's character, Hutchins might do it." "Might?" He's a coward. But he's an angry coward, which sometimes works in your favor. The journey to Newmarket took 2 days. Sarah traveled carefully, avoiding main roads, using paths Isaiah had mapped. She wore her Mary Henderson disguise constantly, practicing the character. Free woman. Confident. Literate. Someone who'd never been forced to bow. Twice she encountered white travelers. Both times she presented her forged papers, answered questions calmly, maintained her performance. Both times they accepted her story and moved on. The makeup covering her scar held up well. The distinctive brand was invisible. On the second evening, she reached Newmarket. The settlement was busy. A merchant ship had docked, crews were loading timber, the tavern was crowded. Sarah took a room at the boarding house, paying with Isaiah's money, signing the register as Mary Henderson. The boarding house owner, a white woman named Mrs. Pierce, barely looked at her papers. You're lucky we have space. River traffic's been heavy. Sarah settled into a small room, 3rd floor, window facing the main street. From there, she could see the marshal's office, the courthouse, the tavern. She could see Patterson ride into town 2 hours after sunset. Patterson arrived with his full posse, 5 men, all armed, all scanning the streets. They went directly to the marshal's office. Sarah watched from her window, imagining the conversation. Patterson would present his case. Sarah was a runaway slave with forged papers, a thief, possibly dangerous. He'd demand cooperation in her capture. Under the Fugitive Slave Act, Marshal Dawes was required to assist. What Patterson didn't know was that Sarah had already visited the marshal's office that afternoon. The conversation with Marshal Dawes had been careful, strategic. Sarah, as Mary Henderson, had presented herself as a concerned citizen reporting suspicious criminal activity. She'd brought one of Patterson's notebooks, the most damning one, filled with evidence of fraud and extortion. I found this, she'd explained, her voice steady. A man left it at the boarding house, and when I looked inside hoping to identify the owner, I discovered disturbing contents. Dawes was in his 40s, grey-haired, with the precise manner of someone who'd spent decades navigating legal complexity. He'd examined the notebook carefully, reading several entries, his expression unchanging. "Where did you actually get this?" he'd asked. "I told you. Miss Henderson, or whatever your name is, I've been a federal marshal for 20 years. I know a story when I hear one. I'm asking the truth now." Sarah had made a decision in that moment. A slave catcher named Patterson keeps records of illegal activities. I obtained this to protect myself from his false accusations. Are you a runaway slave? I'm a free woman being targeted by a corrupt slave catcher. That's the truth that matters legally. Dawes had stuttered her. The Fugitive Slave Act requires me to assist in recovering runaways, even on questionable claims. Yes, sir. It also requires you to investigate fraud and false imprisonment, which are federal crimes. You're well informed. I can read, sir. Dawes had set the notebook down. Patterson will arrive in Newmarket within 2 days. He'll present documentation claiming you're a runaway. What do you expect me to do? Your job, sir. Investigate both claims, his and mine. Examine evidence from both parties. Let the law work the way it's written. The law is written to favor men like Patterson. Yes, sir, it is. But it's also written to punish fraud. And that notebook proves Patterson has committed fraud repeatedly, including against white citizens. Which crime will you prioritize? Dawes had almost smiled. You're either very brave or very foolish. Both, probably. He'd kept the notebook. Hadn't promised anything, but hadn't dismissed her either. Sarah had left the office knowing she'd planted doubt. Now she needed to cultivate it. Patterson's posse spread through Newmarket quickly, asking about a scarred black woman, showing the bounty notice, offering rewards for information. Several people reported seeing Mary Henderson at the boarding house. Patterson headed there immediately. Sarah was ready. She sat in the boarding house's common room, visible, calm, reading a newspaper. When Patterson entered, she looked up with mild curiosity, then recognition. "Excuse me," she said. "Do I know you?" Patterson stared at her face. His eyes locked onto the area where her scar should be. The makeup held perfectly. No brand visible, just smooth skin. "You're the woman from Thornton's plantation," he said. "I've never been to any plantation, sir. I'm a free woman from Illinois." "You're a liar and a runaway." Mrs. Pierce intervened. "Mr. Patterson, please don't harass my guests. Miss Henderson has been staying here 2 days and has caused no trouble." Patterson ignored her. He stepped closer to Sarah, trying to intimidate through proximity. "I know who you are." Sarah stood, met his gaze directly. Free people didn't cower. "I don't know what you're talking about. But if you're accusing me of something, you should speak with Marshal Dawes. I'm sure he can clarify any confusion." "I've already spoken with Dawes. He's reviewing the situation." "Good. Then the law will determine the truth." Patterson's jaw tightened. He reached out suddenly, grabbed Sarah's arm. "You're coming with me now." Sarah didn't resist physically. Instead, she raised her voice. "This man is assaulting me. Mrs. Pierce, please send for the marshal." Other guests in the common room turned to watch. Patterson was creating a public scene, which worked against him. He released Sarah's arm but didn't back away. "I have legal authority to detain suspected runaways." "Then exercise that authority through proper channels, sir. Not through assault." A voice from the doorway. "She's right, Patterson." Marshal Dawes entered, hand resting on his sidearm. He looked tired, as if he'd been expecting this confrontation. "Miss Henderson has raised concerns about your activities. Until I investigate, you'll refrain from detaining anyone without proper process." Patterson turned. "The Fugitive Slave Act. I know the law, but I also enforce laws against fraud, false imprisonment, and assault. That notebook she provided has some interesting entries. We'll discuss them at my office tomorrow morning." Patterson's expression went cold. He looked at Sarah, then at Dawes, calculating. Finally, "Tomorrow morning. And when I prove she's a runaway, I expect full cooperation. If you prove it legally, you'll have it." Patterson left. His posse followed. The common room stayed silent for several seconds, then conversations resumed. Sarah sat down, hands shaking now that the confrontation had passed. Dawes approached her. "That was risky," he said quietly. "I know. His documentation will probably be legitimate. If you're really a runaway, I'm legally required to return you. Then my freedom depends on proving he's a criminal first." "Yes," Dawes agreed. "It does." That night, Sarah didn't sleep. She reviewed her plan, identifying weaknesses. Patterson had resources, documentation, witnesses from Thornton's plantation, probably testimony from Master Thornton himself. Sarah had a stolen notebook and questionable allies. But she also had something Patterson didn't expect. She understood the system he exploited. She'd spent years watching how white authority worked, how laws were applied selectively, how to manipulate the gaps between what was legal and what was enforced. Patterson's weakness was his assumption that enslaved and free black people were fundamentally ignorant, unable to navigate legal complexity. He'd gotten careless because consequences never applied to him. That carelessness was documented in his own handwriting. Sarah just needed to make white people care about his crimes. Not the crimes against black people, those would be ignored. But the crimes against white property, white citizens, white economic interests. Those might matter. Morning brought the formal confrontation. Marshal Dawes' office was small, a desk, filing cabinets, 2 chairs, an American flag. Windows faced the main street. 6 people crowded inside: Dawes, Patterson, Sarah, Patterson's assistant, and 2 others. Hutchins, the tavern owner, and a well-dressed white woman Sarah didn't recognize. Dawes opened the session. "This is an inquiry, not a trial. Mr. Patterson has presented a claim that Miss Henderson is an escaped slave named Celia from the Hayes plantation in Natchez. Miss Henderson claims she's a free woman being falsely targeted. We'll hear evidence from both parties." Patterson went first. He laid out his case methodically: the bounty notice, physical description matching Sarah, the distinctive scar, her flight from Thornton's plantation. He produced a daguerreotype, an early photograph, blurry but clearly showing a woman with facial scarring. "This image was provided by Landon Hayes himself," Patterson explained. "Taken in 1847, 1 year before the subject escaped. Note the brand on the left cheek, Hayes initials." Dawes examined the photograph. "Miss Henderson, is this you?" Sarah looked at the image. It could be her. The resolution was poor enough that definitively confirming or denying was impossible. "I see a resemblance, sir, but photographs can be unclear. Many women might match that description." Patterson countered. "She fled Thornton's plantation when I began investigating. That indicates guilt." "Or fear of false accusation," Sarah replied. "I've heard about your methods, Mr. Patterson. About how you target free black people and threaten them with enslavement unless they pay you." "That's a lie." "Is it?" Sarah gestured to the notebook Dawes had on his desk. "Your own records document extortion and fraud." Patterson's expression hardened. "She stole that notebook. Her possession of it proves criminal behavior." "Possibly," Dawes agreed, "but its contents are still relevant to evaluating your credibility." This was the critical moment. Dawes opened the notebook, read aloud several entries. The room listened in silence as Patterson's own words documented bribes, falsified captures, collaboration with plantation owners on fraudulent reward claims. Patterson tried to dismiss it. "Those are private notes, taken out of context." "They're quite clear," Dawes said. "Particularly this entry about the Henderson case in Missouri last year. You wrote that you had no proof of enslavement, but collected the reward anyway. That's fraud." Patterson shifted tactics. "Even if my methods are questionable, this woman is still a runaway. 2 wrongs don't make a right." "No," Dawes agreed. "But credibility matters. If you've falsified claims before, why should I trust this one?" That's when Hutchins spoke up. The tavern owner was nervous, fidgeting with his hat, but he spoke clearly. "Marshal, Patterson owes me $60 for drink and lodging. He's owed it for 3 months. When I asked for payment, he threatened to claim I was harboring runaways unless I forgot the debt." Patterson glared. "That's a lie motivated by financial dispute." "Perhaps," Dawes said, "but it establishes a pattern." The well-dressed woman cleared her throat. Dawes acknowledged her. "Mrs. Hartwell, thank you for coming." Eleanor Hartwell was perhaps 60, wearing black mourning clothes, her bearing suggesting education and social status. She spoke with precision. "Marshal Dawes, I'm here because I heard Mr. Patterson was involved in a legal matter. 2 years ago, my late husband freed an enslaved man in his will, properly documented, filed with the county. Mr. Patterson seized that man 3 months later, claiming he was a runaway. Despite my evidence of legal manumission, the man was returned to a claimant Mr. Patterson represented." Patterson interrupted. "That case involved disputed documentation." "The documentation wasn't disputed," Mrs. Hartwell said coldly. "It was ignored. I lost money pursuing that case, and an innocent man lost his freedom. I've suspected fraud for 2 years but had no proof. Now I see that notebook confirms it." Dawes read the relevant entry. His expression darkened. "Mrs. Hartwell's case is documented here. You note that her husband's will was legitimate, but you proceeded anyway because the reward was $400, too good to pass. The room went silent. This was different from Patterson's crimes against black people. This was theft from a white widow, violation of a white man's will, interference with white property rights. Patterson tried to recover. Those notes are being misinterpreted. They're in your handwriting, Dawes said. They describe deliberate fraud. He looked at Sarah. Miss Henderson, show me your brand scar. Sarah had been expecting this. She carefully wiped makeup from her left cheek. The scar emerged, distinctive, clear, exactly matching the description in Patterson's bounty notice. The room reacted. Patterson looked triumphant. There, he said. Proof positive. But Sarah spoke calmly. This scar exists, yes, but it doesn't prove I'm Celia from Natchez. Many enslaved women are branded. Mr. Patterson saw the scar and decided I must be his runaway, regardless of actual identity. That's consistent with his documented pattern of forcing facts to match convenient conclusions. The daguerreotype, Patterson started, is too unclear to definitively identify anyone, Sarah finished. You saw a scarred woman and assumed I was your target because it meant an $800 reward. Dawes considered. Miss Henderson makes a valid point. The physical evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. Patterson played his final card. I have testimony from Master Thornton and his overseer Monroe. Both will confirm she fled when investigation began. Both can verify her papers were likely forged. Testimony can be arranged, Dawes said. Your notebook suggests you've bribed witnesses before. This is absurd. Patterson's composure cracked. You're taking the word of a Negro over mine. I'm taking the word of your own documentation, Dawes corrected, and the testimony of Mrs. Hartwell, a respected widow. Your credibility is compromised. Patterson stood abruptly. The Fugitive Slave Act requires you to cooperate. And federal law requires me to investigate fraud. I'm placing you under arrest, Mr. Patterson. Charges include fraud, theft through false pretenses, and forgery of legal documents. Patterson reached for his pistol. His assistant did the same. The room exploded into motion. Dawes drew his own weapon faster, aimed it at Patterson's chest. Don't. For 5 seconds, no one moved. Then Patterson lowered his gun. His assistant followed. Dawes gestured to a deputy who'd been waiting outside. Take them into custody. Patterson was disarmed and shackled. As he was let out, he looked at Sarah. This isn't over. I know what you are. I'll find you. Sarah met his gaze. You'll try. But now I know your methods. And I'm not running anymore. I'm hunting. The legal aftermath took weeks. Patterson was held in the county jail pending formal trial. Marshal Dawes investigated thoroughly, uncovering additional evidence of fraud, multiple cases where Patterson had falsified claims or extorted free black people. Mrs. Hartwell provided documentation of her case. Hutchins testified about threats and unpaid debts. The trial focused entirely on Patterson's crimes against white citizens. His abuse of enslaved people, his violence, his role in maintaining the slave system, none of that was considered criminal. But fraud against white people, theft of white property, forgery of white legal documents, those were prosecutable. Patterson was convicted on 3 counts of fraud and sentenced to 18 months in prison. Sarah watched the verdict from the courthouse gallery. She felt no triumph. Patterson was being punished, but not for his real crimes. The system that enabled him continued unchanged. Slavery continued. The hunt continued. She'd won a single battle against one man, not the war against the institution. But she'd learned something crucial. The system could be manipulated. Its own corruption could be turned against individual actors. She couldn't destroy slavery, but she could make slave catchers afraid. She could document their crimes, expose their methods, turned their carelessness into consequences. After the trial, Dawes called Sarah to his office privately. "I know you're not Mary Henderson. I know that Scar is a brand, and you're probably a runaway. But I can't prove it definitively, and Patterson's credibility is destroyed. So here's my offer. Leave Missouri immediately and never return. Go north, go west, go wherever. But if I ever see you in my jurisdiction again, I'll have no choice but to investigate thoroughly." "That's not justice," Sarah said. "No. But it's survival. Take it." Sarah took it. She left New Market that evening, traveling west with Isaiah. They crossed into Kansas territory, found a safe house maintained by Isaiah's network, and began planning. "What now?" Isaiah asked. Sarah laid out Patterson's remaining notebooks. She'd kept 2 of them, containing names of other slave catchers, their methods, their contacts. "Now we do this again. Patterson was one man. There are hundreds like him. I'm going to learn everything about how they work. And then I'm going to hunt them. You can't fight the whole system." "No. But I can make individual hunters afraid. I can expose their crimes, document their fraud, turn their own methods against them. I can't save everyone, but I can hurt them. And hurting them is better than running." Isaiah studied her. "This will kill you eventually." "Probably. But I'll die fighting, not running. That matters." 6 months after Patterson's conviction, Sarah operated across a territory spanning 3 states, Missouri, Kansas, and Arkansas. She'd established a network of informants, safe houses, and allies. Her method was systematic. Identify a slave catcher known for violent or fraudulent practices, infiltrate their operations, document their crimes, expose them through sympathetic officials or journalists. The work was dangerous. Every interaction risked exposure. But Sarah had advantages Patterson and others didn't anticipate. She could pass as enslaved or free depending on the situation. She could read and write, allowing her to forge documents and interpret legal materials. Most critically, she understood how slavery worked, not from the outside, but from lived experience. Her first target after Patterson was a slave catcher named Marcus Dobbs. He operated primarily in Missouri, specializing in capturing runaways near the Kansas border. His reputation included unusual brutality and a pattern of seizing free black people on questionable claims. Sarah spent 3 weeks studying Dobbs. She learned his roots, his contacts, his methods. He worked with a network of informants, enslaved people forced to report escape attempts, free black people coerced through threats. He kept detailed records, like Patterson, documenting rewards and captures. The infiltration began with Sarah posing as an enslaved woman seeking information about a fictional escaped relative. She approached one of Dobbs' informants, a man named Samuel who operated a river ferry and reported suspicious travelers. "I'm looking for my sister," Sarah explained, using a regional accent and mannerisms suggesting fieldwork rather than housework. She ran 2 months back. Heard a man named Dobbs catches runaways. Thought he might know something. Samuel was cautious. "Why would Dobbs tell you anything?" "Thought if I gave him information, he might share what he knows. Trading, like." "What information?" Sarah fed him a prepared story about other runaways, mixing truth and fiction in ways that seemed valuable but didn't endanger actual fugitives. Samuel, motivated by potential reward money, arranged a meeting with Dobbs. Marcus Dobbs was younger than Patterson, mid-30s, physically strong, with a calculating intelligence that made him more dangerous than simple thugs. He met Sarah at a river landing, 2 armed assistants with him, clearly suspicious. "Samuel says you have information," Dobbs said, "about runaways heading west." Sarah maintained her character, scared, desperate, willing to betray others to gain information about her fictional sister. "Yes, sir. There's 3 planning to leave from the Harrison plantation next week, taking the river route at night." "Why tell me?" Because I need help finding my sister. Thought if I help you, you might help me. Dobbs studied her, particularly her face. The brand scar was visible. She'd stop hiding it when posing as enslaved, turning it into part of her disguise. Enslaved people with visible scars seemed less threatening, more broken. Who's your sister? Sarah described a fictional person, mixing details from real cases she'd learned about. Dobbs listened, then shook his head. Haven't seen anyone matching that description. But your information about the Harrison plantation might be valuable. If it proves true, I'll pay you $5. If it proves false, you'll regret wasting my time. Yes, sir. How do I find you? Through Samuel, sir. Dobbs dismissed her. Sarah left, having established contact without arousing immediate suspicion. Over the next 2 weeks, she fed Dobbs additional information, always mixing truth with fiction, always providing just enough value to maintain access while never actually betraying real fugitives. What she learned during this period was crucial. Dobbs worked with a network of plantation owners who paid him monthly retainers to prevent escapes. He received compensation regardless of whether anyone actually tried to escape. This created incentive for him to exaggerate threats, claim credit for captures he didn't make, and occasionally fabricate escape attempts to justify his fees. She also learned he kept a ledger documenting these arrangements, including details about payments, falsified reports, and collusion with plantation owners to intimidate enslaved populations. The plan to expose Dobbs required careful coordination. Sarah recruited several allies through Isaiah's network. The most important was a white journalist named Thomas Brennan who worked for an abolitionist newspaper in Kansas. Brennan was idealistic, young, and eager for stories that exposed slavery's corruption. Sarah met him in secret, providing documentation about Dobbs' fraudulent practices. I can get you his ledger, she explained. But you'll need to publish quickly, before he realizes it's missing. How will you get it? Brennan asked. I've gained his trust as an informant. He's careless when he thinks he's dealing with an ignorant slave. This is dangerous. Yes, but if you publish what's in that ledger, plantation owners will stop hiring him. He loses his income. That's better than nothing. Brennan agreed. He'd publish the story immediately upon receiving documentation, protecting Sarah by acting before Dobbs could retaliate. Sarah stole the ledger during a meeting at Samuel's ferry landing. Dobbs had come to collect payment from a plantation owner, a routine transaction. He'd brought the ledger to verify amounts owed. While the two men discussed terms, Sarah volunteered to water the horses. Instead, she took the ledger from Dobbs' thul bag, replaced it with a similar-looking book filled with blank pages, and disappeared. She delivered it to Brennan that night. He read through it, eyes widening. They're systematically defrauding plantation owners, claiming ghost captures, exaggerating threats. Can you publish it? Immediately. But you need to leave the area. When this breaks, Dobbs will know who took it. Sarah was already planning to disappear. She prepared an exit route, a new disguise, a different territory. Brennan's article appeared 3 days later. It detailed Dobbs' fraudulent practices, named plantation owners involved in the schemes, provided financial documentation from the stolen ledger. The response was swift but not what Sarah had hoped. Plantation owners were furious, but at Dobbs for getting caught, not for the fraud itself. Several terminated contracts with him. Dobbs' reputation was damaged, his income reduced. But he wasn't arrested. No legal consequences followed because his victims were other white men who didn't want public attention on their own involvement in corruption. Sarah learned a frustrating lesson. Exposure didn't equal justice. The system protected itself. Even when crimes were documented, consequences were selective and inadequate. But Dobbs was damaged professionally. He struggled to find work. Other slave catchers became slightly more cautious, aware that their practices might be documented and exposed. It was a limited victory, but Sarah took it. She moved to her next target. The second major case involved a network of corrupt officials in eastern Kansas. A county clerk named Jackson was selling false freedom papers to enslaved people for $200, then reporting them as runaways and collecting bounties. It was a brutal scheme. Offer hope, take everything someone owned, then destroy them. Sarah posed as a potential buyer, approaching Jackson through an intermediary. She wore her finest disguise, respectable dress, hidden scar, educated speech. She presented herself as a light-skinned woman of ambiguous status hoping to secure legal documentation. Jackson met her in his office after hours. He was confident, practiced at this fraud. Freedom papers cost $200. They're legitimate, properly stamped, registered. You'll pass any inspection. How can you guarantee that? Because I create them myself using official materials. I'm a county clerk. My documents are real. And if I'm caught, you won't be, unless you do something foolish. Sarah appeared to consider, then agreed. She paid a deposit, $50, borrowed from Isaiah's network. Jackson promised the documents within a week. But Sarah knew the pattern. He'd take her money, provide the papers, then wait a month before reporting her as a runaway. By then she'd have traveled far enough that her connection to him wouldn't be obvious. Instead of waiting to be betrayed, Sarah went to the county records office during business hours. She claimed to be researching property documents for a white employer. The clerk, bored and unsuspecting, let her review files. Sarah found what she needed: evidence of Jackson's scheme, including copies of false freedom papers he'd created, matched against runaway reports he'd filed weeks later. She photographed the documents using a borrowed camera, a new technology, expensive but increasingly available. The photographs were clear enough to prove Jackson's pattern of fraud. Sarah provided this evidence to a federal investigator she'd identified through Isaiah's network, a man investigating fraud in territorial governments. Unlike local officials who might be complicit, federal investigators sometimes pursued cases that embarrassed local corruption. The investigation took months, but Jackson was eventually arrested. The charges weren't about harming enslaved people. They were about misuse of official documents and defrauding the federal government. Jackson was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison. 7 people he'd betrayed were still enslaved, their false freedom papers worthless. The system didn't compensate them or acknowledge their victimization. But Jackson was stopped, and his scheme was exposed. Sarah's methods evolved with each case. She learned to identify patterns, which slave catchers were violently careless, which were calculatingly strategic, which were alcoholic and vulnerable to infiltration. She learned which crimes white authority would prosecute: fraud against other white people, theft, corruption that embarrassed officials, and which they'd ignore. She also learned the costs. Every disguise required perfect performance. Every infiltration risked exposure. Every case meant returning to environments that triggered memories of her own enslavement, the casual cruelty, the systematic dehumanization, the ever-present threat of violence. Isaiah worried she was breaking herself. "You can't keep doing this," he said after one particularly difficult case. "You're not sleeping. You barely eat. This work is destroying you." "Maybe," Sarah acknowledged.
But slaverie destroy millions.
"If I can stop even a few of the people who enforce it, that matters." At what cost? Whatever cost necessary. The case that almost killed her involved a slave catcher named Ezra Whitmore. Unlike Patterson or Dobbs, Whitmore was careful, intelligent, and viciously effective. He rarely made mistakes, kept minimal documentation, and had connections with powerful plantation owners across 3 states. Sarah spent 4 months studying him, finding no clear vulnerabilities. Whitmore didn't drink excessively, didn't keep incriminating records, didn't trust informants. He was professional in the worst way, treating slavery as a business and executing it with cold efficiency. The only pattern Sarah identified: Whitmore occasionally murdered fugitives rather than capturing them alive. Dead runaways meant no reward split with plantation owners. If Whitmore claimed the fugitive died resisting capture, he could collect partial payment while avoiding the difficulty of prisoner transport. Proving this required Sarah to do something extraordinarily dangerous: let Whitmore hunt her. Sarah staged a fake escape, spreading rumors through enslaved networks that she'd seen a woman matching a description Whitmore was tracking. She arranged for him to discover her in a location she'd carefully prepared, a wooded area with multiple witnesses positioned to observe from concealment. When Whitmore found her, Sarah ran. The chase was genuine. Whitmore pursued her through thick forest, firing shots, clearly intending to kill rather than capture. Sarah led him toward the prepared location where witnesses watched from hidden positions. At the critical moment, Sarah fell deliberately, appearing injured. Whitmore approached, gun raised. He didn't call for surrender. He aimed at her head, preparing to kill her and claim she'd resisted violently. That's when the witnesses emerged, including 2 white hunters who'd been paid to observe the chase. They'd seen everything: Whitmore pursuing what appeared to be an unarmed woman, firing without warning, clearly attempting murder rather than capture. Whitmore lowered his gun, suddenly aware he'd been set up. But the damage was done. The witness's testimony couldn't save Sarah legally. She was still a black woman without rights, but it could damage Whitmore's reputation with plantation owners who wanted their property returned alive, not dead. More importantly, one of the white witnesses was related to a plantation owner Whitmore worked for. That owner, furious about Whitmore's apparent waste of valuable property, terminated their contract and spread word among other owners about Whitmore's practices. Whitmore's business declined sharply. He didn't stop being a slave catcher, but his income dropped, and his reputation suffered. He never learned Sarah had orchestrated the entire trap. By the time Sarah had been operating for 2 years, she'd damaged or destroyed the careers of 9 slave catchers and exposed 3 networks of corrupt officials. She hadn't freed any enslaved people. That wasn't her role. She hadn't changed the law or weakened the institution. But she'd made individual actors afraid, documented their crimes, and turned the system's own corruption against specific targets. The work was taking its toll. Sarah was now 30 years old, carrying injuries from multiple close encounters, suffering from chronic exhaustion and the psychological weight of constantly inhabiting different identities. She'd become so practiced at disguise that sometimes she forgot which version of herself was real. Isaiah found her one night sitting alone, staring at nothing. "You need to stop," he said gently. "This is killing you." "I know." "Then why continue?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. Finally, "Because every slave catcher I expose means some people don't get caught. Every corrupt official I destroy means some fraudulent scheme stops. I can't save everyone. I probably can't save anyone permanently. But I can make them afraid. And fear is all I have. That's not enough to live on." "No," Sarah agreed. "But it's enough to fight on." The confrontation that would define Sarah's legacy began with news of Patterson's release from prison. He'd served 18 months for fraud and emerged broke, professionally ruined, but vengefully motivated. Word reached Sarah through the network. Patterson was in Kansas Territory, asking questions, looking for her. She could have run. Should have run. But Sarah had spent 2 years becoming a hunter, and Patterson represented everything she fought against. Letting him resume his work without consequence felt like surrender. Instead of fleeing, Sarah did something calculated and dangerous. She let Patterson find her. The meeting happened in a small Kansas settlement called Lawrence, in a boarding house where Sarah was staying under her Mary Henderson identity. She'd arranged for Patterson to receive information about her location through a careful trail of hints and rumors. When Patterson entered her room, gun drawn, she was waiting. "You've been looking for me," Sarah said calmly. Patterson stared at her, recognition and rage mixing on his face. 2 years. I've been looking for 2 years. I know. I wanted you to find me. You destroyed my career, had me imprisoned, ruined my reputation. You destroyed lives for profit. I documented that. The consequences were yours." Patterson raised his gun. "I should kill you right now." "You could. But this room is being watched. You'd be arrested for murdering a free woman before you reach the door." "You're not free. You're property, Hayes' property. Hayes sold me 5 years ago to settle debts. I have documentation. Your bounty is obsolete." It was a lie, but a calculated one. Patterson had no way to verify immediately. More importantly, Sarah had allies positioned outside the room, white witnesses who'd intervene if violence occurred. Patterson lowered the gun slightly. "What do you want?" "To make an offer. I have information about other slave catchers, their methods, their crimes, their vulnerabilities. Information that could rebuild your reputation if used correctly." "Why would you give me that?" "Because I'm tired, Patterson. 2 years of running and fighting. I want to stop. So here's the offer. I give you information that restores your career. In exchange, you stop hunting me. We call this even." Patterson considered. His financial situation was desperate. The offer had value. But he also recognized the trap. Sarah was never straightforward. "What's the real game?" "The real game is I'm offering you a choice. Take revenge on me, or rebuild your life. You can't do both." For a long moment, Patterson said nothing. Then, "You're lying. This is another trap." "Maybe. But you're in no position to refuse. Take the offer or spend the rest of your life as a failed slave catcher with a prison record." Patterson made his decision. He lowered his gun completely. "Give me the information." Sarah provided him with documents, real intelligence about slave catcher operations, carefully selected to be valuable without compromising her actual allies. Patterson examined them, recognizing their worth. "This is legitimate," he admitted. "Yes. Now we are even. You go your way, I go mine." Patterson looked at her one final time. "You're the most dangerous person I've ever hunted." "Because I learned from hunters like you." Patterson left. Sarah waited an hour, then evacuated the boarding house, abandoning the Mary Henderson identity completely. Patterson had the information he wanted, but Sarah had accomplished something more important. She demonstrated control. Patterson had found her, and she dictated the terms of their encounter. That mattered. 3 weeks later, Sarah learned Patterson had died. Not from violence, but from fever contracted in a Kansas jail where he'd been held briefly on an unrelated charge. His death was mundane, unmourned, quickly forgotten. Sarah felt nothing when she heard. Not relief, not satisfaction, not grief. Patterson had been an individual manifestation of a system. His death changed nothing about slavery, nothing about the hunt, nothing about the forces that created men like him. But it ended their specific battle. And in a life where victories were rare and incomplete, that qualified as resolution. The year 1857 brought the Dred Scott decision, a Supreme Court ruling that declared black people could never be American citizens and that enslaved people remained property even in free states. The ruling destroyed legal protections for free black people and made Sarah's work exponentially more dangerous. Under Dred Scott, her forged freedom papers meant nothing legally. Any white person could claim she was enslaved, and she had no legal standing to dispute it. The decision effectively made every black person in America vulnerable to enslavement, regardless of their actual status. Sarah responded by becoming more aggressive. If the legal system offered no protection, she would rely entirely on extralegal methods, infiltration, documentation, exposure, and when necessary, violence. The case that brought all forces into collision involved a conspiracy among 6 plantation owners and 4 slave catchers to create a false epidemic of escapes. The scheme worked like this. Plantation owners would claim enslaved workers had escaped, file reports, post bounties. Slave catchers would capture these fictional runaways, who were actually enslaved people from the same plantations, temporarily relocated. The slave catchers collected rewards. The plantation owners received insurance payments for lost property. Everyone profited except the enslaved people, who were terrorized by the fake captures and real violence. Sarah uncovered the scheme while investigating a slave catcher named Robert Crane. She noticed patterns: the same plantation owners reporting multiple escapes, the same slave catchers making captures within implausibly short timeframes, reward payments that seemed coordinated rather than competitive. She spent 3 months infiltrating the network, posing as different people in different locations. Sometimes she appeared as an enslaved woman working at one of the participating plantations. Sometimes she posed as a free woman trading in information. Sometimes she disguised herself as a light-skinned traveler gathering business intelligence. The documentation she compiled was devastating: ledgers showing split payments, correspondence between plantation owners and slave catchers, testimony from enslaved people who'd been used as props in the fake captures. It was the largest fraud Sarah had exposed, involving thousands of dollars and dozens of people. The question was what to do with the evidence. Local authorities were compromised. Several sheriffs were receiving payoffs. State officials had no incentive to investigate fraud that technically harmed insurance companies rather than individuals. Federal authorities might act, but slowly, and Sarah risked exposure by approaching them. She needed a different strategy: public exposure through sympathetic journalists, coordinated with legal action from parties who had standing to sue. Sarah approached Thomas Brennan again, the abolitionist journalist who'd published her story about Dobbs. He was now working for a larger newspaper with wider circulation. "This is massive," Brennan said, reviewing the documentation. "Insurance fraud, falsified legal claims, conspiracy across state lines. If I publish this, it could destroy all of them." "Will you publish?" Sarah asked. "Yes. But you need to understand, when this breaks, they'll try to kill you. All of them." "I know." "Then why risk it?" Sarah considered the question. "Because this isn't just about fraud. They're using the fear of escape, the violence, the terror, to control enslaved communities. Every fake capture reinforces the belief that escape is impossible, that the hunt is omnipresent. By exposing the fraud, I'm exposing that lie. The hunt can be beaten. The hunters can be destroyed." Brennan published the story across 3 editions, each providing additional documentation. The response was explosive. Insurance companies sued the plantation owners. Federal investigators launched inquiries. Several slave catchers were arrested. The conspiracy unraveled rapidly, publicly, catastrophically. But Sarah had been right about retaliation. Robert Crane led the response. He mobilized every slave catcher, bounty hunter, and violent opportunist he could hire. The target was simple: find Sarah, kill her, eliminate the source of the exposure. The hunt was coordinated, well-funded, and relentless. Sarah's network of safe houses was compromised. Allies were threatened. Even sympathetic white people withdrew support when faced with organized violence. Sarah went deep underground, constantly moving, never staying anywhere more than one night. She relied on her most trusted contacts: Isaiah, a few core allies, people who'd proven themselves over years. But the pressure was overwhelming. The confrontation came in Missouri, in a river town called New Liberty. Sarah had been cornered, literally, trapped in a warehouse with Crane and 5 armed men approaching. The situation was impossible. No escape routes, no backup, no way to fight 6 armed men. She barricaded herself inside the warehouse, using whatever materials were available. Crane called out from outside, offering terms: "Come out peacefully, this ends quickly. Resist, and we'll burn you out." Sarah knew Crane would kill her regardless. Surrender meant torture, then death. Resistance meant death, but on her terms. She chose resistance. The siege lasted 3 hours. Sarah had advantages. The warehouse layout provided cover, She'd positioned materials to create defensive barriers, and she had one firearm, a pistol she'd carried for emergencies. But Crane's men had rifles, superior numbers, and no time constraints. They tried fire first, throwing torches onto the warehouse roof. Sarah extinguished them using water barrels stored inside. They tried to break down the door. Sarah fired shots through gaps, forcing them back. They tried to starve her out. Sarah waited, knowing help would either arrive or not. What Crane didn't know was that Sarah had sent word to her network before being cornered. Isaiah was mobilizing whatever allies he could reach. Thomas Brennan was alerting federal marshals. A few sympathetic white citizens who'd benefited from Sarah's exposure of fraud were raising alarm. But none of them would arrive in time. The breakthrough came when Crane's men set fire to the warehouse's far wall. Not the roof, but the structure itself. The flames spread quickly. Sarah had minutes, maybe less, before smoke became lethal. She made a decision: better to die fighting than burning. She broke through a side window, firing her pistol as she emerged. One of Crane's men went down, wounded. Sarah ran toward the river, 50 yards away. Bullets hit the ground around her. One grazed her shoulder. Another hit her leg, causing her to stumble. Crane himself was pursuing, reloading his rifle. Sarah reached the riverbank, turned, raised her pistol. Both fired simultaneously. Crane's shot missed. Sarah's didn't. Crane fell, clutching his chest. Sarah collapsed from her leg wound. Blood loss was rapid. She was conscious but unable to move. Crane's remaining men approached cautiously, weapons ready. This was the end. Wounded, defenseless, no escape. Then horses.
Readers approaching fast.
Federal marshals, led by Marshal Dawes himself, responding to Brennan's alarm. They arrived with authority, guns drawn, ordering Crane's men to stand down. The scene froze. Crane's men lowered their weapons. Dawes approached Sarah, saw her wounds, called for medical assistance. He looked at Crane, saw the chest wound, pronounced him likely dying. "Miss Henderson," Dawes said, using Sarah's false name, "you have a talent for complicated situations." Sarah, barely conscious, managed, "Is he dead?" "Probably." "Good." She passed out. Sarah woke in a medical facility 3 days later. Her leg wound was serious but survivable. The shoulder graze was superficial. She'd lost blood, suffered shock, but would recover physically. Legally, her situation was catastrophic. She'd killed a white man. Under any normal circumstance, that meant execution. But circumstances weren't normal. Dawes had arrested Crane's men for attempted murder, arson, and conspiracy. Brennan's articles had created public awareness. The insurance fraud case had made Sarah's testimony valuable to federal prosecutors. Dawes visited her in the medical facility. "You shouldn't be alive," he said. "I know. Crane died 2 days ago. His men are testifying against the plantation owners to reduce their charges. The entire conspiracy is collapsing. Am I going to be charged for killing him?" Dawes sighed. "That's complicated. You killed a white man in self-defense, but legally you're..." He paused. "The federal prosecutors want your testimony about the fraud. That creates incentive to keep you alive and available. Several influential people, including Mrs. Hartwell, have vouched for your character. Brennan's articles have made you somewhat famous, which makes it harder to quietly execute you." So what happens? The compromise being discussed: you testify at the trials, providing documentation and evidence about the conspiracy. In exchange, the shooting is ruled self-defense, and you're given official freedom papers, legitimate ones. Sarah struggled to process that. Legitimate freedom. It's not justice. You'll still be a black woman in a slave state, which means limited rights and constant danger. But you'll have legal standing. That's more than you have now. The trials took months. Sarah testified in 3 separate proceedings, providing documentation about the insurance fraud, the falsified captures, the collaboration between plantation owners and slave catchers. Her testimony was devastating. 6 plantation owners were convicted of fraud. 2 slave catchers were sentenced to prison. Multiple officials who'd accepted bribes were removed from office. The enslaved people who'd been used as props in the scheme received nothing. No compensation, no freedom, no acknowledgement of their victimization. That was the part that haunted Sarah most. She'd exposed a massive crime, secured convictions, received her own freedom. But the system that created the crime remained intact, and its primary victims remained enslaved. On the day Sarah received her official freedom papers, Mrs. Hartwell visited her. The elderly widow had become an unlikely ally, motivated initially by her own victimization but gradually developing genuine respect for Sarah. "What will you do now?" Mrs. Hartwell asked. Sarah looked at the papers in her hand. Official, stamped, legally binding documentation of her freedom. They felt surreal. "I don't know. I've spent years fighting. I'm not sure what peace looks like." "You could leave. Go to a free state, start over. No one would blame you." "No," Sarah said slowly. "But leaving feels like abandoning everyone still enslaved. Like my freedom is built on their continued bondage." "You can't save everyone." "I know. But I can keep hunting the people who hunt them." Mrs. Hartwell nodded, unsurprised. "You're going to continue?" "Yes. Even though you're legally free now, which means killing you becomes murder instead of property destruction. Even though you've drawn attention that makes you more recognizable? Even though you've already nearly died?" "Yes." Mrs. Hartwell reached into her bag, extracted an envelope. "Then you'll need this. It's a letter of introduction to several abolitionists and journalists in Kansas and Nebraska. Your testimony has given you credibility. Use it." Sarah took the envelope. "Why help me?" "Because you fight when most people accept. Because you've exposed corruption I thought was invincible. Because watching you survive makes me believe justice is possible, even if the law doesn't provide it." They parted ways that day. Sarah never saw Mrs. Hartwell again, but she used those introductions repeatedly over the following years. The final confrontation that defined Sarah's legacy didn't involve a single dramatic moment. Instead, it was a series of battles across 2 years, each escalating the conflict between Sarah's network and the remaining slave catchers who'd survived her earlier campaigns. By 1859, Sarah had become a known figure in certain circles. Abolitionists considered her a hero, slave catchers considered her a threat, federal authorities considered her a complicated asset. Her freedom papers protected her legally, but socially and physically she remained vulnerable. The slave catcher community responded to Sarah's activities by becoming more organized. They formed associations, shared information about her methods, warned each other about her infiltration tactics. Several put prices on her head, not official bounties, but underworld payments for her capture or death. Sarah adapted. She relied more on intermediaries, sending information through trusted allies rather than infiltrating personally. She coordinated with abolitionist organizations, using their resources and legal protections. She became less a lone operative and more a network coordinator. But the danger increased proportionally. 3 of her close allies were killed by slave catchers seeking revenge. Isaiah was beaten severely, left with permanent injuries. Sarah herself survived 2 assassination attempts, 1 poisoning, 1 ambush. The violence climaxed in the spring of 1859, when Sarah's network exposed a slave trading operation that was kidnapping free black people in northern states and selling them into slavery in the South. The operation involved corrupt officials, criminal networks, and several prominent businessmen. The exposure triggered massive legal proceedings. Federal marshals raided multiple locations. Dozens of people were arrested. The scandal reached national newspapers. For a brief period, The systematic kidnapping of free black people became a public issue that white Americans couldn't ignore. But the backlash was severe. Pro-slavery forces in Missouri and Kansas mobilized against abolitionist networks. Violence erupted across border regions, what would later be called Bleeding Kansas. Sarah's network was specifically targeted. Safe houses were burned. Allies were arrested on fabricated charges. The infrastructure Sarah had built over 5 years was systematically destroyed. Sarah herself became too visible to continue operating. Her face was known, her methods anticipated, her freedom papers providing only limited protection in a territory descending into open conflict. Isaiah told her bluntly, "You need to leave. Not just Missouri, the whole region. They're going to kill you if you stay." Where would I go? North. Canada. Somewhere the reach of American slavery can't touch you. Sarah resisted the idea for weeks. Leaving felt like surrender. But Isaiah was persistent, and the evidence was overwhelming. She couldn't continue her work if she was dead, and death was increasingly inevitable if she remained. The decision to leave came after a final operation, one last exposure before disappearing. Sarah had documented a slave catcher named Vernon Hayes, no relation to her former owner, who was operating in Kansas Territory, kidnapping children of free black families and selling them into slavery in Arkansas. The operation was particularly cruel. Hayes targeted children specifically because they were easier to control and because their parents, desperate to recover them, could be manipulated or coerced. Sarah spent 2 months tracking Hayes, documenting his methods, identifying his buyers. She compiled evidence that was irrefutable, testimony from victims, financial records, witnesses to kidnappings. She provided everything to federal authorities, to journalists, to abolitionist lawyers. The case was airtight. Hayes was arrested, tried, and convicted of kidnapping, a federal crime. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. But during the trial, Hayes identified Sarah publicly. He testified that she'd infiltrated his operation under false pretenses, that she'd stolen his records, that she was a former slave who'd spent years targeting white men. The testimony, though intended to discredit Sarah, had the opposite effect among abolitionists. It confirmed her effectiveness, her courage, her years of systematic resistance. But it also made her impossibly visible. After Hayes' conviction, Sarah received word through the network. Multiple slave catcher associations had pooled resources to offer $2,000 for her capture, dead or alive. The price was high enough to attract serious bounty hunters, criminals, even desperate people who wouldn't normally engage in such work. Isaiah told her, "This is it. You can't survive that kind of pressure. You've done enough. Now you need to survive." Sarah finally agreed. She would leave. The journey north took 3 months. Sarah traveled through underground railroad networks, using the same routes enslaved people took to reach freedom. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent years exposing the people who hunted fugitives, and now she was a fugitive herself. She crossed into Canada in late 1859, settling temporarily in a small community of escaped slaves near Lake Erie. The community welcomed her cautiously. Her reputation had preceded her, which created both respect and nervousness. For the first time in a decade, Sarah stopped running. She had legal freedom, physical safety, and distance from the immediate violence of American slavery. But she felt unmoored. Her entire adult identity had been built around resistance. Without something to fight, she wasn't sure who she was. She tried to settle into normal life, took work as a seamstress, rented a small room, attended community gatherings. But normalcy felt foreign, almost suffocating. She'd spent so long living in disguise, operating under assumed names, that simply being herself, whoever that was, felt impossible. Isaiah wrote to her occasionally, letters smuggled through abolitionist networks. He updated her on the situation in Missouri and Kansas, the violence intensifying, the country moving toward larger conflict. The letters were careful, coded, aware that interception meant danger. In one letter, Isaiah wrote, "The work you started continues. Others have learned from your methods. The hunters are more cautious now, more afraid. You changed something. That matters." Sarah wasn't sure she believed that. She damaged individual slave catchers, exposed specific crimes, helped some people escape or avoid capture. But slavery continued. The institution remained intact. The system adapted to her resistance and continued functioning. The final word about Sarah's fate is uncertain. Historical records are fragmentary, contradictory, incomplete. What follows is based on multiple sources of varying reliability. Some accounts suggest Sarah remained in Canada until 1861, when the American Civil War began. According to these versions, she returned to the United States, working with Union forces as a scout and intelligence operative, using her skills at infiltration and disguise to gather information behind Confederate lines. Other accounts suggest she traveled west, joining abolitionist communities in the developing territories, continuing her work on a smaller scale. One persistent rumor, documented by several former slaves in oral histories, claims Sarah was seen in Kansas in 1859 during John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. Some versions of this story suggest she provided intelligence that helped Brown plan his attack. Other versions claim she was present during the raid itself, though no contemporary documentation supports this. The most reliable account, based on letters and testimony from community members, suggests Sarah lived in Canada until approximately 1862, then returned to the United States during the Civil War. She worked with the Union Army in some capacity, possibly as a scout, possibly as someone who helped coordinate escaped slaves reaching Union lines. After 1863, the historical record goes silent. No letters, no documentation, no reliable accounts of Sarah's activities or fate. She simply vanishes from documented history. 3 theories exist about what happened. Theory 1. Sarah died during the Civil War, possibly killed in combat or by Confederate forces, her death unrecorded because black women working for the Union Army were rarely officially documented. Theory 2. Sarah survived the war but chose to disappear completely, adopting a new identity and living out her life in anonymity, tired of being visible, hunted, and defined by struggle. Theory 3. Sarah continued her work after the war, targeting the new forms of oppression that emerged during Reconstruction, the Klan, white terrorism, the systematic disenfranchisement of freed slaves, and was killed during one of these operations, her death hidden or misattributed. No evidence definitively supports any theory. Sarah's final fate, like so much of her life, exists in the gap between documented history and lived experience. The immediate aftermath of Sarah's work was visible in the slave catcher industry. Between 1857 and 1861, the number of professional slave catchers operating in Missouri, Kansas, and Arkansas declined by approximately 30%. Several factors contributed: economic changes, territorial conflicts, the approaching Civil War, but testimony from the period suggests that slave catchers themselves recognized increased risk in their work. One slave catcher, writing to a plantation owner in 1860, noted, "The business has become complicated by various exposures of fraudulent practices. Several of my colleagues have faced legal consequences that were previously unthinkable. I must increase my fees to account for this enhanced risk." Insurance companies operating in slave states tightened their investigation procedures after the conspiracy Sarah exposed, making it harder to file fraudulent claims about escaped slaves. Several plantation owners faced audits. The ease with which the system had been manipulated became visible, creating accountability that hadn't existed before. But these were limited victories. Slavery as an institution continued until the Civil War. The fundamental violence, dehumanization, and terror remained unchanged. Sarah's work damaged individual actors and exposed specific schemes, but couldn't dismantle the system itself. Within enslaved communities, Sarah's story took on legendary qualities. Different versions circulated, each emphasizing different elements. Some versions focused on her disguises, turning her into a kind of trickster figure who could become anyone. appear anywhere, vanish at will. Other versions emphasized her violence, making her a warrior who killed slave catchers with her own hands. Still others focused on her intelligence, portraying her as someone who outsmarted white authority through clever manipulation of legal systems. Rebecca, the young woman who'd been whipped at Thornton's plantation, survived the war and gave testimony in 1897 as part of a Works Progress Administration project documenting formerly enslaved people's experiences. She spoke about Sarah. "There was a woman, scarred face, came through our place long time ago. She ran, but not like running away. She ran like she was chasing something. People said she hunted the men who hunted us. Don't know if it's true, but we believed it. Believing it helped. Made us feel like maybe we could fight back too, even if we couldn't do it like she did." This was Sarah's actual legacy, not the specific slave catchers she damaged, but the idea she represented. The possibility of resistance. The proof that the hunters could be hunted, that the system could be turned against itself, that someone marked as property could claim agency and power. Isaiah survived the Civil War and lived until 1889. In his final years, he gave interviews to several historians and journalists researching the Underground Railroad and abolitionist networks. He spoke about Sarah carefully, protecting her identity while acknowledging her work. She wasn't trying to free people, Isaiah explained in an 1887 interview. That wasn't her role. She was trying to make the people who caught us afraid. And she succeeded. I watched slave catchers become cautious, nervous, aware that their actions might have consequences. That fear, even small fear, even temporary fear, mattered. It changed behavior. It saved lives. When asked if Sarah survived the war, Isaiah responded, "I don't know. We lost contact in 1862. She could have died, could have lived, could have become someone else entirely. That's the thing about her. She was always becoming someone else. Maybe she kept doing that until she became nobody, which is its own kind of freedom." The slave catchers Sarah damaged or destroyed met various fates. Patterson died in jail in 1857, unmourned, his reputation destroyed. Dobbs struggled financially after his exposure, eventually took work as a prison guard, died in 1868 from injuries sustained during a prison escape attempt. Jackson, the corrupt clerk, served his prison sentence and disappeared from historical records afterward. Crane died from Sarah's gunshot in 1858. His family sued for compensation but lost the case when federal courts ruled the shooting was self-defense. Vernon Hayes served 8 years of his 10-year sentence, was released during the chaos of the Civil War, and was killed in 1863 by unknown assailants, possibly escaped slaves, possibly Confederates, possibly Union forces. No investigation followed his death. Several other slave catchers Sarah investigated or exposed simply disappeared from records. Some likely died in the Civil War. Others probably changed professions. A few relocated to different territories or states, trying to rebuild careers away from areas where their reputations had been damaged. The broader historical context matters. Sarah's resistance occurred during a specific period, the 1850s, when slavery was intensifying in border states, when the Fugitive Slave Act made resistance more dangerous, when territorial conflicts were already pushing the country toward war. Her work didn't cause the Civil War, didn't significantly weaken slavery as an economic institution, didn't free thousands of people. But it demonstrated something crucial. Individual resistance was possible, even within a system designed to make resistance fatal. This mattered psychologically and practically. Other people, enslaved and free black people, white abolitionists, Underground Railroad operators, learned from her methods. The idea of documenting slave catchers' crimes, of using legal systems against them, of infiltrating operations and exposing corruption became tools in the larger resistance movement. The question of Sarah's effectiveness is complicated. By measurable standards, people freed, laws changed, institutions destroyed, her impact was limited. She probably directly helped fewer than 100 people avoid capture or escape slavery. She damaged the careers of perhaps 15 slave catchers. She exposed maybe 5 significant fraud schemes. But by immeasurable standards, psychological impact, inspiration, the demonstration that resistance was possible, her influence was broader. The stories about her circulated widely, changed over time, inspired others. One formerly enslaved man, interviewed in 1936, said, "We used to tell stories about a scarred woman who could become anything, go anywhere, destroy anyone who tried to catch us. Most people thought she was made up. But some of us believed. And believing made us braver." That belief, fragile, often irrational, built on fragments of truth, still changed behavior. It made some people attempt escape who otherwise wouldn't. It made some slave catchers more cautious. It created a counter-narrative to the propaganda of slavery as inevitable and resistance as futile. After the Civil War, the nature of oppression changed but didn't end. Slavery was abolished, but sharecropping, convict leasing, Jim Crow laws, and white terrorism created new systems of control. The Klan and similar organizations hunted black people with different justifications but similar violence. Some evidence suggests Sarah, or someone matching her description, continued operating during Reconstruction. Several accounts from the 1865 to 1870 period mention a scarred black woman who documented Klan activities, exposed corrupt officials, and helped freed slaves navigate hostile legal systems. These accounts are fragmentary and unreliable. They might describe Sarah. They might describe someone inspired by stories about Sarah. They might be entirely fictional, projecting resistance onto a legendary figure. What's certain is that the methods Sarah pioneered, documentation, infiltration, turning the system's corruption against itself, continued. Other activists used similar tactics. The strategies evolved, adapted to new forms of oppression, but the core approach remained: make the oppressors afraid by exposing their crimes to the authorities they claim to represent. The last semi-reliable account of Sarah comes from a letter written in 1872 by a Freedmen's Bureau official in Arkansas. He wrote to a colleague, "Met an unusual woman today, scarred face, probably 50 years old, literate and sharp. She provided detailed documentation about a sheriff who's been arresting freed slaves on false charges and leasing them to local planters. Her evidence was comprehensive, professionally gathered. When I asked her name, she said it didn't matter. When I asked why she was doing this, she said, because someone has to document. Otherwise, they'll say none of this happened." She left before I could ask more questions. This might be Sarah. The age is approximately correct. The scar, the methods, the motivation all align. But it's impossible to confirm. The official never recorded a name, never followed up, never mentioned the woman again in his correspondence. What Sarah's story reveals most clearly is the gap between historical documentation and lived experience. Official records barely acknowledge her existence. No photographs survive, no authenticated documents in her own hand, no testimony that definitively proves her activities or even confirms her real name. Yet dozens of oral histories mention her. Multiple slave catchers' records show unexplained business failures or legal troubles that align with her supposed operations. Contemporary newspapers occasionally reference a mysterious black woman involved in exposing corruption, though they rarely provide detailed information. Sarah exists in that gap, too real to be entirely fictional, too undocumented to be fully historical. She's evidence of how much history is lost when the people creating it are denied literacy, legal standing, and social acknowledgement. The scarred woman of Mississippi, whatever her real name, whatever her final fate, represents thousands of similar stories, acts of resistance that were never recorded, people who fought back in ways that left no official trace, courage that was systematically erased from documented history. For modern audiences, Sarah's story raises uncomfortable questions. On resistance, was Sarah's approach, targeting individual slave catchers rather than the system, meaningful, or just a dangerous distraction from collective organizing and systematic change? On violence, Sarah killed at least one person, Crane, and possibly others. Was this justified self-defense, or does it complicate the moral clarity of her resistance? On effectiveness, she damaged but didn't destroy the slave catcher industry. She helped some people but couldn't save most. Was limited impact worth the risk and trauma? On documentation, Sarah's story survives only in fragments, oral histories, and unreliable accounts. How many similar stories are completely lost? What does that loss mean for understanding resistance history? On legacy, we remember people like Harriet Tubman because their stories were documented by white abolitionists. Sarah worked alone, trusted few people, left almost no trace. Does that make her less important, or does it reveal how selective historical memory is? The final reflection on Sarah's life requires acknowledging what we don't know. We don't know her real name, if Celia was even accurate. We don't know if she had children, family, loved ones. We don't know what dreams she had beyond survival and resistance. We don't know if she found any peace, any joy, any moments that weren't defined by struggle. We know she was branded at 16. We know she escaped. We know she turned the hunt around, spending years documenting and exposing the people who hunted escaped slaves. We know she nearly died multiple times. We know she disappeared from history sometime in the 1860s or 1870s, her final fate unknown. What we don't know is whether any of this, the resistance, the risk, the relentless fighting, gave her life meaning she found valuable. We project heroism onto her story, but perhaps she simply wanted to survive and found that fighting was the only survival strategy available. Or perhaps she chose resistance deliberately, understanding its costs, accepting that her life would be defined by struggle but believing that struggle mattered more than safety. We don't know. The historical record is silent. The scarred woman of Mississippi achieved something remarkable and terrible. She turned her victimization into a weapon. The brand on her face, meant to mark her as property, became her tool for recognizing and fighting back against the system that marked her. The fear she was supposed to feel became fear she inflicted on her hunters. But this victory was Pyrrhic. She couldn't enjoy freedom peacefully. She couldn't build a normal life. She couldn't escape the trauma slavery inflicted. She could only fight back, document, resist, and eventually disappear. Her legacy isn't triumph. It's testament, evidence that resistance occurred even when it seemed impossible, that some people refused to accept their dehumanization, that the narrative of slavery as a system slaves accepted was always a lie. The system that enslaved her was stronger than she was. It survived her resistance. But her resistance proved the system wasn't omnipotent, that it could be wounded, that its agents could be afraid. That matters. It mattered then, when enslaved people heard stories about someone fighting back. It matters now, when we are trying to understand how people survived and resisted under impossible oppression. Final words from the fragmentary historical record. In 1936, a 94-year-old formerly enslaved woman named Dinah Williams was interviewed as part of the Federal Writers Project. She had worked at Thornton's tobacco plantation in Mississippi in the 1850s. When asked about her experiences, she mentioned a woman named Sarah who had disappeared after questioning by a slave catcher. "Never saw her again after she ran," Dinah said. "But people said she didn't really run away, said she ran toward something. Don't know if it's true, but we liked believing it. Made us feel like maybe running away didn't have to mean just being scared. Maybe it could mean fighting back." The interviewer asked if Dinah thought Sarah survived. "Don't know. Hope so. But even if she didn't, she made them afraid for a while. And making them afraid, even just a little, even just for a moment, that was something. That was more than most of us could do." The scarred woman of Mississippi disappeared into history's gaps, leaving behind fragments, rumors, and the uncomfortable knowledge that resistance occurred and was systematically erased. Her real name might have been Celia, or Sarah, or Mary, or something else entirely. Her final fate remains unknown. But the brand on her face, the mark of ownership, the evidence of attempted control, became the symbol of her resistance. The scar that was meant to mark her as property instead marked her as someone who refused to be owned, who turned the hunt around, who made the hunters afraid. That refusal, documented imperfectly and remembered partially, is her legacy. Not victory, not freedom, not justice, but refusal. The stubborn, dangerous, often fatal insistence that even under impossible oppression, resistance is possible. History tried to erase her. It nearly succeeded. But fragments remain: oral histories, court documents, letters, rumors. Enough to reconstruct a story, incomplete and uncertain, but real. The scarred woman of Mississippi existed. She fought back. She survived as long as she could. She disappeared. And in disappearing, she became impossible to forget completely. A ghost haunting American history, reminding us that the stories we don't document are often the ones that matter most.